One moment can shatter everything you thought was certain. For me, it was arriving late to my granddaughter's piano recital after sitting with a dying neighbor. "You'll never be Grandpa of the Year," my daughter spat, those cruel words becoming the first shot in a war I never saw coming. What I didn't know then was that she had already been poisoning my grandchildren against me for months, and the shocking reason why was hidden in a letter my late husband left me, a secret that could destroy our entire family. When my own grandchildren were forced to testify in court about whether they should be allowed to see me, their trembling voices revealed the devastating truth. Mom never let us visit Grandma. We cried and begged, but she said it wasn't possible. Now I faced an impossible choice: use my husband's letter to save my relationship with my grandchildren, or protect the daughter who was trying to destroy me. The truth would cost dearly, but some silences hurt more than words ever could. If you've ever felt the sting of family betrayal or struggled with secrets that threaten to tear apart everything you love, this story will break your heart and then carefully put it back together again. Follow my channel for more emotional true stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty. Like this video and comment where you're watching from. I read every comment and would love to hear your thoughts on what you would have done in my position. I remember it like it was yesterday. The concert hall in Columbus, Ohio, was packed with smiling parents, mothers, and grandparents clutching bouquets for their little performers. The air was thick with anticipation and the faint scent of perfume, too many kinds mingling together. I'd spent most of that afternoon rushing from Riverside Methodist Hospital, where I'd held the trembling hand of my neighbor, Earl, who'd suffered a heart attack. No family by his side, just me, Martha Williams, 67 years old, sitting there watching his chest rise and fall, wondering if each breath would be his last. "Don't leave, Martha," he'd whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't want to die alone." How could I say no? This man had shoveled my driveway every winter since Richard passed. He'd fixed my leaking roof during that terrible storm last year. Not because I asked, because that's what neighbors used to do for each other. By the time the doctor stabilized him, I was already late. So late. My hands shook as I fumbled with my car keys in the parking garage. The digital clock on my dashboard seemed to mock me as I hit every red light on High Street. My heart pounded against my ribs as I finally pulled into the school parking lot, tires screeching slightly on the asphalt. I clutched my purse to my chest and practically ran through the hallway, my sensible shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The sound of applause hit me like a slap as I pushed open the heavy doors. Final applause. I was too late. My 8-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, had already finished her piano recital, the one she'd practiced for months, the one where she would play Moonlight Sonata, a piece far too advanced for most children her age. But not for my Sophie. Never for my Sophie. Parents were already standing, gathering their things, hugging their little performers, and there was my daughter, Catherine, standing near the stage with Sophie and my 10-year-old grandson, Jack. Her eyes found mine across the crowded room, and something cold washed over me. There was no relief in her gaze. No, "Thank goodness you made it, Mom." There was only steel and ice. I made my way toward them, already forming explanations, apologies that tumbled in my mind. "Catherine, honey, I'm so sorry. Earl had a heart attack, and there was nobody else." She cut me off with a raised hand. Sophie looked up at me. Disappointment etched across her small face, but there was forgiveness in her eyes that her mother's lacked. "You never show up when it matters," Catherine said, her voice loud enough for nearby parents to turn and stare. "Always someone else's emergency, someone else's needs. Sweetheart, please, if you'd just let me explain." That's when she said it, the words that would echo in my nightmares for months to come. "You'll never be Grandpa of the Year." Her voice dripped with contempt, a public execution of my character. Dad would have been here no matter what. He would have made it work. The knife twisted deeper. Richard had been gone for 3 years, but Catherine wielded his memory like a weapon whenever she could. As if I hadn't lost him too. As if I hadn't spent 42 years loving that man with every fiber of my being. "Mom, I played really well," Sophie whispered, reaching for my hand. "Maybe next time." "There won't be a next time," Catherine snapped, pulling Sophie away. "We're done waiting for someone who clearly has other priorities." I watched, frozen in place, as she herded the children toward the exit, Sophie looking back over her shoulder with confusion in her eyes. The small bouquet of yellow roses, Sophie's favorite, hung limply at my side, the cellophane wrapper crinkling in my tight grip. What Catherine didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, was that I'd been keeping secrets. Terrible secrets. The kind that change families forever. In my bedroom dresser, beneath stacks of neatly folded sweaters, lay a yellowed envelope. Richard had given it to me on his deathbed, his fingers trembling as he pressed it into my hands. "When the time comes, Martha," he'd whispered, "you'll know when to open it, but be careful. The truth in here will either save our family or destroy it completely." I hadn't opened it. Not yet. But as I stood there in that concert hall, watched by strangers who had witnessed my public shaming, I wondered if the time had finally come. What I didn't realize then was that missing Sophie's recital wasn't just another disappointment to Catherine. It was the excuse she'd been waiting for. The final piece of evidence she needed to begin her campaign against me. A campaign that would eventually lead us all to a courtroom, with my own grandchildren forced to testify about a grandmother they were taught to believe had abandoned them. I drove home alone that night, the unopened bouquet on the passenger seat beside me, petals already beginning to fall. The house was dark when I arrived, too quiet without Richard's laughter filling the rooms. I placed the roses in a vase anyway, touching the soft petals as tears slid down my cheeks. "What would you do, Richard?" I whispered to the empty kitchen. "What would you do if you knew what was coming?" But of course he already knew. That's why he'd left me the envelope. That's why his last words to me had been, "Be stronger than I was, Martha. Be brave when the time comes." I just didn't know then how much courage I would need. The days that followed Sophie's recital were like walking through a thick fog. I'd wake up reaching for Richard's side of the bed, still empty after 3 years, then remember Catherine's face, twisted with anger and disappointment. "You'll never be Grandpa of the Year." The words haunted me like a vengeful spirit, following me from room to room in my too quiet house. I tried calling her the next morning. Once, twice, 3 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. On the 4th attempt, I left a message, my voice shaking like autumn leaves. "Catherine, honey, please call me back. I need to explain about yesterday. Earl would have died alone if I hadn't stayed. You know I wouldn't have missed Sophie's recital for anything less than—" The voicemail cut me off. Too many words, too much explanation. None of it mattered anyway. By Wednesday, I couldn't bear the silence. I baked Sophie's favorite chocolate chip cookies, the ones with extra vanilla that Richard used to sneak before they'd cooled. I placed them in a blue tin, tied it with a ribbon, and drove to Catherine's house in Bexley, that beautiful suburb where she lived with her husband, Mark, and my grandchildren in a 2-story colonial with perfect white shutters. I remember standing on their porch surrounded by Catherine's immaculate flower beds, peonies and hydrangeas that I'd helped her plant when they first bought the house. Such a happy day that had been. Richard was still alive then, carrying bags of mulch and telling his corny jokes that made Sophie giggle uncontrollably. I rang the doorbell, heart pounding against my ribs like a caged bird. Through the stained glass panel, I could see movement inside. Someone was home. I rang again, clutching the cookie tin to my chest like a shield. Finally, the door opened, but it wasn't Catherine. It was my grandson, Jack, his eyes wide with surprise. "Grandma," he exclaimed, looking over his shoulder nervously. "Mom said you were sick and couldn't come over." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sick? I hadn't been sick a day since Richard's funeral. "I'm not sick, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down despite the protest from my arthritic knees. "I've been trying to call, but—" "Jack, who's at the door?" Catherine's voice called from inside the house. His face paled. "It's just the mail lady," he lied, and my heart broke a little more. 10 years old and already learning to lie to protect his mother's feelings. Or was it to protect himself from her anger? "Here," I whispered, pressing the cookie tin into his small hands. "Share these with your sister. I love you both so much." He nodded, eyes darting back toward the house. "I gotta go, Grandma. Mom doesn't want—" The door closed before he could finish, but I knew what he meant to say. "Mom doesn't want you here." I stood on that porch for several more minutes, staring at the brass knocker Richard had installed as a housewarming gift. The perfect family home for his perfect daughter. I wondered if she knew how much he'd worried about her, even at the end. If she had any idea what secrets that yellowed envelope in my dresser contained. That night I noticed something strange as I was walking my little terrier, Rusty, around the neighborhood. Catherine's car was parked outside my sister-in-law Patricia's house, Richard's sister who had barely spoken to me since his funeral. Patricia had always been closer to Catherine than to me, but seeing them together now sent a chill down my spine. Patricia had been there when Richard died. She'd heard his last confession, had seen the envelope he gave me. "Some things are better left buried, Martha," she'd said to me at the funeral, her voice low and threatening. "If you know what's good for this family, you'll burn whatever Richard gave you." But I couldn't. Not when his last request had been to keep it safe. The next day, the whispers began. First at the grocery store, where Betsy Allen, whose daughter went to school with Sophie, avoided eye contact in the produce section. Then at church on Sunday, where people who had known me for decades suddenly found the hymnal fascinating when I caught their gaze. "Did you hear about Martha Williams?" I overheard Mrs. Peterson say to another woman in the bathroom. "Apparently she's been neglecting those poor grandchildren. Catherine is beside herself with worry." I froze in the stall, toilet paper still in hand, as the women continued their character assassination. "Always thought she was a bit off after Richard died," the other woman replied. "Shame about those kids, though. Catherine's right to keep them away." I waited until they left before emerging, legs weak and stomach churning. Who was spreading these lies and why? The answer came when I spotted Patricia sitting with Catherine in the back pew, their heads close together whispering. In the weeks that followed, gifts I left on Catherine's porch, books for Jack, a doll for Sophie, even a casserole when I heard Mark had the flu, remained untouched until they disappeared, presumably thrown away. My calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back. It was as if I had ceased to exist in their world. One night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, Richard's voice echoed in my memory. "One day, the truth will cost dearly, but it must be told." I wondered if that day had finally come. What I didn't know then, couldn't possibly have known, was that Catherine and Patricia were building more than a wall between me and my grandchildren. They were building a case, a legal case that would force me to either reveal Richard's secret or lose my grandchildren forever. And somewhere in the distance, a clock was ticking down to the moment when all our lives would shatter like fine china dropped on concrete. 3 months passed with no word from Catherine or my grandchildren. Summer faded into fall, and the maples in my backyard turned brilliant shades of crimson and gold, the colors Richard had loved most. October in Ohio always reminded me of him. He'd rake enormous piles of leaves just so Sophie and Jack could jump into them, their laughter echoing across the yard. Now the leaves fell in silence, gathering in lonely heaps that I couldn't bring myself to disturb. It was on a particularly cold October night, when the wind howled through the eaves of our old Victorian home, that I finally broke down. I'd been strong for so long, first through Richard's illness, then his death, and now this inexplicable rejection by my daughter. But everyone has a breaking point. Mine came in the form of a small white envelope in the mail. Inside was an invitation to Jack's school science fair. Not sent by Catherine, of course, but by Jack himself, his wobbly handwriting on the back reading, "Please come, Grandma. I miss you." I clutched that invitation to my chest and wept. Deep, soul-shaking sobs that seemed to rise from the very center of me. I cried until my throat was raw, until my eyes burned and swelled. Rusty whined at my feet, his paws on my knees trying to comfort me in his simple canine way. When the tears finally subsided, I found myself drawn to the master bedroom, to the dresser where Richard's clothes still occupied half the drawers. I couldn't bear to pack them away even after 3 years. Sometimes, on the worst nights, I'd take out one of his sweaters and hold it to my face, searching for any lingering trace of his scent. Pine and coffee and that spicy aftershave he'd used since our first date in 1973. But tonight, I went straight to the bottom drawer, buried beneath stacks of carefully folded cashmere sweaters that he'd never wear again. There it was, the yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax bearing the impression of his college signet ring. My hands trembled as I lifted it out, feeling its weight, not physical, but emotional, the burden of knowledge I'd been too afraid to shoulder. I carried it downstairs to the kitchen table, set it down beside a glass of Merlot I'd poured but barely touched. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second pushing me closer to a decision I'd been avoiding for 3 years. "What am I supposed to do with this, Richard?" I whispered to the empty room. "Is this what you meant about the truth costing dearly?" I ran my fingers over the wax seal, remembering the day he gave it to me. The hospice nurse had just left the room, giving us a rare moment alone. Richard's hand, once strong enough to carry me over the threshold of this very house, had felt like paper in mine. Fragile, thin, the blue veins prominent beneath translucent skin. "Martha," he'd said, his voice barely audible over the oxygen machine, "there's something you need to know." Something I should have told you years ago. I'd tried to shush him, to tell him it didn't matter, that we had said all we needed to say in our 42 years together. But he'd been insistent, reaching for the envelope he'd asked Patricia to bring him. "When the time is right, you'll know," he'd whispered. "But be careful, my love. This could destroy Catherine if handled wrongly. Promise me you'll protect her, even from herself." I had promised, of course. I would have promised him anything in those final hours. But now, as I sat at our kitchen table alone, that promise felt impossible to keep. How could I protect a daughter who had cut me out of her life, who was poisoning my grandchildren against me? With shaking fingers, I broke the seal. The wax cracked with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. Inside was a single sheet of Richard's letterhead, the same paper he'd used for decades in his law practice. His handwriting, normally so precise and neat, was shaky and uneven, evidence of the toll cancer had taken on his once strong body. "My dearest Martha," it began. I took a deep breath and continued reading. The letter detailed a truth so shocking, so fundamentally life-altering, that I had to set it down halfway through, my head spinning. I paced the kitchen, Rusty following anxiously at my heels, before returning to finish it. It wasn't a confession about Richard, as I had feared. It was about Catherine, about a choice she had made in college, a desperate, terrible choice that she had hidden from everyone except her father, a secret that, if revealed, would destroy not only her carefully constructed image as the perfect mother, wife, and daughter, but potentially her marriage to Mark as well. "She made me swear never to tell you," Richard wrote, "but I couldn't leave this world with this between us. You deserve to know why she's always been so hard on you, why she's always trying to prove herself. The guilt has shaped her in ways I fear have become destructive." The letter ended with a plea. "Use this knowledge wisely, Martha. Not as a weapon, but as a key to understanding. Perhaps someday, to healing." I sat there, the letter trembling in my hands, as the full weight of Richard's secret settled over me. This was what Patricia had wanted me to burn. This was what she feared I would use against Catherine. And maybe in my darkest moments of hurt and rejection I would have. But sitting there in the kitchen where we had raised our daughter, where Richard had bounced our grandchildren on his knee, I couldn't bring myself to even consider it. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Should I use this to force Catherine to let me see my grandchildren? Should I confront her with what I now knew? Or should I continue to protect her, as Richard had asked, even at the cost of my own happiness? The invitation to Jack's science fair lay on the table beside the letter, his childish handwriting a reminder of what was at stake. In that moment, I made a decision that would set us all on a collision course with truth and consequence. What I didn't know then was that the choice I made that night would eventually lead us all to a courtroom, where the most painful truths would finally come to light. Jack's science fair fell on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, changing my outfit 3 times before settling on a powder blue cardigan that Richard had always said brought out my eyes. I styled my silver hair carefully, applied a touch of lipstick, and even spritzed on the perfume that Sophie once said made me smell like cookies and flowers. I wanted to look my best, not just for Jack, but for the inevitable confrontation with Catherine. The middle school gymnasium was packed with parents, teachers, and excited students when I arrived. Colorful trifold boards lined the tables, displaying everything from volcano models to complex robotics. The noise was overwhelming. Children calling to parents, teachers giving instructions, proud conversations about scientific achievements. I clutched my purse tightly as I scanned the room for Jack's project. I spotted him before he saw me. My grandson stood tall beside his display on renewable energy, a subject Richard had sparked his interest in during their weekend workshops in the garage. Jack had Richard's serious expression, the same furrowed brow when concentrating. My heart swelled with love and pride. Then I saw Catherine. She was standing on the other side of Jack's table, her back to me, one hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Mark was there too, filming with his phone, completely absorbed in his son's explanation of wind turbine efficiency. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving. The letter in my dresser drawer seemed to burn in my memory, its contents a nuclear option I wasn't ready to deploy. But then Jack looked up and saw me. His face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he waved enthusiastically. "Grandma, you came," he called out, loud enough for Catherine to hear. She turned slowly, her face a mask of controlled anger. Mark lowered his phone, confusion evident in his expression. But I only had eyes for Jack, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "Of course I came, sweetheart," I said, approaching the table. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." "Mom, I told you I invited Grandma," Jack said to Catherine, his voice tinged with a mix of defiance and nervousness. "I told you she'd come." Catherine's smile was tight, her eyes cold. "Jack, why don't you go get some punch? I need to speak with your grandmother." Jack looked between us, sensing the tension. "But I want to show her my project." "Now, Jack," Catherine said firmly. He slunk away reluctantly, casting one last hopeful glance in my direction. I gave him what I hoped was a reassuring smile. As soon as he was out of earshot, Catherine turned to me, her voice low but sharp. "What are you doing here? We had an agreement." "No, Catherine, you decided." "I never agreed to anything," I replied, keeping my own voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "He's my grandson. He invited me." Mark stepped forward, placing a hand on Catherine's arm. "Kathy, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this, Mark," she snapped, shrugging off his touch. "To me," she hissed, "you have no right to be here, not after everything." "What everything, Catherine?" I asked, fighting to keep my composure in the crowded gymnasium. "Missing one recital? Being late because I was with a man who thought he was dying? Is that really worth cutting me out of their lives?" Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Don't pretend that's all this is about. You know exactly what you did, but I didn't know. Unless—" A cold realization washed over me. Had Richard told her about the letter before he died? Did she think I was going to reveal her secret right here in front of the entire school? Before I could respond, a woman approached us. Mrs. Hendricks, Jack's science teacher. Her smile faltered slightly as she sensed the tension between us. "Mrs. Williams? Jack's grandmother?" she asked, looking at me. I nodded, grateful for the interruption. "Jack talks about you constantly," she said warmly. "He told me you were the one who helped him build his first circuit board last year. That's what sparked his interest in renewable energy." Catherine's face tightened even more, if that was possible. "She hasn't been around much lately," she said curtly. "Not by choice," I countered, unable to stop myself. Mrs. Hendricks looked uncomfortable. "Well, the judges will be coming by soon. Perhaps we should let Jack return to his project?" As if on cue, Jack reappeared, clutching a cup of red punch that sloshed dangerously close to his white shirt. "Grandma, come see how the wind turbine works," he said, reaching for my hand. Catherine stepped between us. "Jack, Grandma was just leaving." The hurt on his face was like a physical blow. "But she just got here." "It's okay, buddy," Mark interjected, shooting an apologetic glance my way. "Grandma can come back another time." "When?" Jack demanded, his voice rising. "You always say that, but she never gets to come over." People were starting to stare. Catherine's face flushed with embarrassment. She'd always cared so much about appearances, about what others thought of her. Perfect Catherine with her perfect life. "Jack, that's enough," she hissed. "No, it's not." His outburst shocked us all. "You told us Grandma didn't want to see us anymore. You said she was too busy with other people. But she's right here. She came because I asked her to." A heavy silence fell over our small group. Catherine's lie hung in the air between us, exposed for what it was. I saw Mark's expression change as he looked at his wife with new eyes, questioning. "Is that true, Catherine?" he asked quietly. "Did you tell the kids Martha didn't want to see them?" She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. "I think," I said carefully, my heart breaking for Jack, who stood between us, tears welling in his eyes, "that we should continue this conversation another time. This is Jack's big day, and he deserves our full support." Catherine looked as though she wanted to argue, but Mrs. Hendricks chose that moment to announce that the judges were making their rounds. The moment was temporarily diffused, but the damage was done. I stayed for the judging, standing a respectful distance away while Catherine and Mark positioned themselves on either side of Jack. When he won third place, I clapped until my hands hurt, tears of pride blurring my vision. As families began to disperse, I approached one last time, pressing a small gift-wrapped package into Jack's hands. "For you, sweetheart. Your grandfather would have been so proud." I left before Catherine could protest, but not before I heard Jack's excited gasp as he unwrapped the junior engineer toolkit that had once belonged to Richard. What I didn't know as I drove home that evening was that this confrontation had set something irreversible in motion. Within a week, I would receive a certified letter from Catherine's attorney, and the battle for my grandchildren would move from school gymnasiums to courtrooms. The time that Richard had warned me about had finally arrived. The Franklin County Family Court building was imposing, all stone and columns and stern-faced security guards who checked my purse with suspicious thoroughness. I'd never been inside a courtroom before. Richard had been the lawyer in our family, not me. He would have known how to navigate these waters, how to speak the language of legal jargon and procedural rules. Without him, I felt adrift, vulnerable. My attorney, Elaine Kaplan, met me in the lobby. She was a petite woman with a steel-gray bob and eyes that missed nothing. A former colleague of Richard's, she'd agreed to take my case pro bono when she heard what was happening. "Ready, Martha?" she asked, her hand gentle on my elbow. Was I ready? Ready to fight my own daughter for the right to see my grandchildren? Ready to possibly reveal Richard's secret in open court? No, but I nodded anyway. "Remember what we discussed," Elaine said as we walked toward courtroom C. "Let me do the talking. Catherine's attorney will try to provoke you, to make you seem unstable or unfit. Don't take the bait." The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, with polished wooden benches and the seal of Ohio hanging prominently behind the judge's bench. Catherine and Mark were already seated at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a shark-like man in an expensive suit. Patricia sat directly behind them, her face a mask of righteous indignation. What hurt most was seeing Sophie and Jack sitting on a bench near the back, supervised by a court-appointed guardian. They looked so small, so out of place. Sophie's eyes widened when she saw me, and she gave a tiny wave before Patricia leaned over and whispered something that made her lower her hand. Judge Abernathy was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She began by explaining that this was a preliminary hearing to determine if there were grounds for Catherine's petition to legally restrict my access to the children. "Mrs. Williams," the judge said, addressing Catherine, "please state for the court why you believe your mother should be denied visitation rights." Catherine stood, smoothing her tailored skirt. "Always so put together, my daughter. Always so concerned with appearances. Your Honor, my mother has demonstrated a pattern of unreliability and emotional manipulation that has negatively impacted my children," she began, her voice steady. "She repeatedly makes commitments to them that she fails to keep, causing emotional distress. The lies flowed from her lips with such ease that I found myself wondering if she actually believed them. She described incidents that never happened, missed birthdays, broken promises, inappropriate comments. She painted a picture of me as neglectful, selfish, even potentially harmful to my grandchildren's emotional development. Most concerning," Catherine continued, "is her behavior since my father's death. She's become increasingly erratic, fixated on old grievances and unwilling to respect boundaries I've set for my family's well-being." I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. Elaine placed a warning hand on my arm. "The final straw," Catherine said, her voice breaking in what I recognized as practiced emotion, "was when she showed up uninvited to my son's school event, causing a scene that humiliated him in front of his peers and teachers." Judge Abernathy turned to me. "Mrs. Williams, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Elaine stood. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies these claims. In fact, we have evidence that Mrs. Catherine Reynolds has been deliberately alienating her children from their grandmother by telling them falsehoods about her availability and willingness to see them." "That's not true," Catherine interjected. "Mrs. Reynolds, you'll have your chance to respond," the judge admonished. For the next hour, both attorneys presented arguments. Catherine's lawyer brought up my age, as if being 67 made me incapable of caring for children. My emotional state since Richard's death, normal grief reframed as instability, and even the fact that I sometimes took prescription sleep aids, presented as evidence of substance dependency. When it was Elaine's turn, she methodically dismantled these arguments. She presented phone records showing my numerous attempted calls to Catherine's home, receipts for gifts I'd sent that were returned unopened, and statements from neighbors who had witnessed me leaving presents on Catherine's porch. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Elaine said, "we have reason to believe that Mrs. Reynolds has been actively poisoning her children against their grandmother by telling them that Mrs. Williams Sr. doesn't want to see them, a claim directly contradicted by all evidence." The judge looked thoughtful. "This is a troubling situation," she said after both sides had presented their initial arguments. "Before I make any decisions, I think it's important to hear from the children themselves." My heart stuttered in my chest. "Your Honor, is that necessary?" Elaine asked, clearly concerned about putting Sophie and Jack through this ordeal. I believe it is, Counselor, Judge Abernathy replied firmly. They're old enough to have their voices heard in a matter that directly affects their lives. Catherine looked confident, almost smug. She clearly believed the children would support her version of events. Patricia leaned forward in anticipation, her thin lips curved in a slight smile. The guardian brought Sophie up first, then Jack. They seemed so small standing before the judge's bench, answering questions about their relationship with me. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I listened, terrified of what Catherine might have coached them to say. Sophie, the judge asked gently, can you tell me about your grandmother? Do you like spending time with her? Sophie twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit she'd had since she was tiny. I love Grandma, she said, her voice barely audible. She makes the best chocolate chip pancakes and reads stories with different voices for all the characters. When was the last time you saw your grandmother before today? Sophie's brow furrowed. At Jack's science fair. But before that, a long time. Mom said Grandma was too busy to come see us. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Did you want to see your grandmother during that time? The judge asked. Sophie nodded emphatically. I asked Mom all the time when Grandma was coming over. I even cried on my birthday because I wanted her there. A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. I'd sent a handmade doll for Sophie's birthday that had been returned to me unopened. Jack's testimony was even more damaging to Catherine's case. At 10, he was less inhibited by adult expectations, more willing to speak the unvarnished truth. Mom told us Grandma didn't want to be part of our family anymore, he said bluntly. She said Grandma chose other people over us. But that's not true. Grandma keeps trying to visit and Mom won't let her. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Catherine's face had gone pale. Mark looked shocked, as if hearing this for the first time. Patricia's smug expression had vanished entirely. Did your mother tell you not to talk to your grandmother? The judge asked. Jack nodded solemnly. She said Grandma might say bad things about our family, and we shouldn't listen. Judge Abernathy thanked the children and asked the guardian to take them back to the waiting area. Then she turned to Catherine, her expression severe. Mrs. Reynolds, these testimonies directly contradict your earlier statements. Do you have any explanation for why your children believe you've been preventing contact with their grandmother? Catherine's lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, children often misunderstand adult situations. My client was simply trying to protect them from... I'd like to hear from Mrs. Reynolds directly, the judge interrupted. Catherine stood, her composure cracking visibly. Your Honor, I was trying to provide stability for my children during a difficult time. My mother has issues that I felt were potentially harmful to their emotional well-being. What specific issues are you referring to? Judge Abernathy pressed. Catherine glanced at Patricia, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming. My mother has been threatening to reveal private family matters to manipulate me, Catherine said, her voice hardening. She's been using emotional blackmail to force her way into our lives. She was referring to Richard's letter. She had to be. But how did she know I had read it? Unless Patricia had told her about seeing me with the envelope that night. I felt the weight of the secret pressing down on me, crushing my chest. Should I use it now? Reveal Catherine's long-buried secret to defend myself? The thought made me physically ill. As I sat there, paralyzed by the impossible choice before me, I realized that whatever happened next would permanently alter the course of our family's future. The week between hearings passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. The yellowed envelope sat on my bedside table like a loaded gun. Dangerous, tempting. A last resort I wasn't sure I could bring myself to use. I'd pick it up sometimes, feeling its weight, remembering Richard's final request. Protect her even from herself. But how could I protect someone who was trying to destroy me? I spent hours on the phone with Elaine, discussing strategy for the final hearing. The children's testimony had shifted the judge's perception, but Catherine's accusation of emotional blackmail had planted a seed of doubt. We needed to address it directly. Do you have something on Catherine? Elaine asked bluntly during one of our late-night calls. Something she's afraid you'll reveal? I hesitated, my fingers tracing the edge of Richard's envelope. Yes, I finally admitted. But I promised Richard I wouldn't use it against her. Martha, Elaine said gently, we're talking about your relationship with your grandchildren. Sometimes we have to make difficult choices to protect the greater good. Her words echoed in my mind as I drove to the courthouse for the final hearing. The morning was unseasonably cold for November, frost creating delicate patterns on my windshield that reminded me of the lace on Sophie's christening gown. Catherine had been so happy that day, letting me hold the baby while she and Mark accepted congratulations from friends and family. Where had that daughter gone? When had she started seeing me as the enemy? The courtroom was more crowded this time. News of the dramatic testimony from Sophie and Jack had spread through the legal community, drawing spectators curious to see how the case would resolve. I spotted familiar faces from church, neighbors, even Earl from down the street, still recovering from his heart attack but determined to show support. Catherine sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her back so straight it looked painful. Mark was beside her, but there was a new distance between them that hadn't been there before. Patricia occupied the same spot as last time. Her eyes narrowed when they met mine. The most significant change, however, was at our table. Tucked securely in my purse was Richard's envelope, its seal now broken, its contents memorized after countless readings. I had made my decision during the night, after hours of agonizing and one final conversation with Richard's portrait that hung in our bedroom. "What would you have me do?" I had asked the silent image of my husband. "Use this to save myself or protect her secret as you asked?" His painted eyes offered no answers, but somewhere deep in my heart, I knew what I had to do. Judge Abernathy called the court to order promptly at 9 a.m. "This is the final hearing in the matter of Reynolds versus Williams," she announced. "I understand both parties wish to make closing arguments before I render my decision." Catherine's attorney went first, attempting to recover ground lost during the children's testimony. "Your Honor, while the children's perspective is valuable, they cannot fully understand the complexities of adult relationships. Mrs. Reynolds has legitimate concerns about her mother's emotional stability and the potentially harmful influence she might have on impressionable young minds." He went on to characterize me as manipulative, suggesting I had coached the children on what to say, a claim so absurd I nearly laughed out loud. When had I had the opportunity to coach them when Catherine had kept them from me for months? "Furthermore," he continued, his voice dropping dramatically, "Mrs. Williams has been using sensitive family information to manipulate my client, threatening to reveal private matters unless she's granted unlimited access to the children." Judge Abernathy looked at me over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Williams, these are serious allegations. Do you have any response?" This was the moment. I could feel the weight of the envelope in my purse practically burning through the leather. Elaine looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to produce the evidence we had discussed, to finally reveal what Catherine was so desperate to hide. Instead, I slowly stood, my legs trembling beneath me. "Your Honor, may I address the court directly?" The judge nodded, and I took a deep breath, feeling every eye in the room on me. "I have never threatened my daughter with anything," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's true that my late husband, Richard, entrusted me with information before he died. Information that Catherine might prefer remain private, but I have never, and would never use that as leverage against my own child." Catherine's expression flickered between doubt and fear. She clearly didn't believe me. "In fact," I continued, reaching into my purse and extracting the envelope, "I've brought the letter Richard left me, not to reveal its contents but to demonstrate my commitment to protecting my daughter, even when she's trying to keep me from my grandchildren." A murmur went through the courtroom. Catherine half rose from her seat, her face drained of color. Patricia leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the bench. I held the envelope up for all to see, then turned to face Catherine directly. "I don't know what you think I would do with this, but I want you to know. I would never hurt you that way. Not for anything. Not even to see Sophie and Jack." And then, while the entire courtroom watched in stunned silence, I tore the envelope in half, then quarters, then eighths, letting the pieces flutter to the table before me. Catherine's sharp intake of breath was audible in the hushed courtroom. Tears streamed freely down my face as I watched years of her fear and my pain reduced to confetti on the polished wood. "Your Honor," I said, turning back to the judge, "I just want to be a grandmother to my grandchildren. That's all I've ever wanted." Judge Abernathy's expression was unreadable as she studied me, then Catherine, then the torn remnants of Richard's letter. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said finally, "do you have any response to your mother's gesture?" Catherine sat frozen, her eyes locked on the scattered pieces of paper. For a moment, I glimpsed something in her expression. Not anger or fear, but something that looked almost like relief, maybe even regret. She began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. Mark leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She shook her head slightly, then looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, I need a moment to confer with my attorney." The judge nodded and Catherine huddled with her lawyer, their whispers too low to hear. When she straightened, her face had regained some of its composure, though her eyes remained fixed on the torn letter. "Your Honor, in light of recent developments, I would like to withdraw my petition." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Judge Abernathy raised an eyebrow. "Are you certain, Mrs. Reynolds?" Catherine nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe we can resolve this matter privately." The judge considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. The petition is withdrawn. This matter is dismissed." With a tap of her gavel, it was over. Just like that. Months of pain and separation, reduced to a procedural footnote. As people began to file out of the courtroom, I remained seated, overwhelmed by what had just happened. Elaine squeezed my shoulder. "You did the right thing, Martha. The brave thing." Catherine was gathering her things, avoiding my gaze. Mark hesitated, then approached our table. "Martha," he said quietly, "the kids are in the waiting area. I think they'd like to see you before we go." I looked up at him, searching his face for any clue to what had just happened, what had changed. He offered a small, sad smile. "Thank you," I whispered, rising on unsteady legs to follow him. Behind us, Patricia was helping Catherine collect the torn pieces of the letter, her face a mask of confusion and alarm. Whatever she had expected to happen today, it wasn't this. As I walked toward the door, toward Sophie and Jack waiting beyond, I felt lighter than I had in months. Richard's secret would remain just that, a secret. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for healing after all. Victory should have tasted sweeter. The first weekend with Sophie and Jack after the court hearing was a bittersweet affair, filled with moments of joy shadowed by lingering tension. Catherine hadn't come herself. Mark had dropped the children off at my house on Saturday morning with overnight bags and awkward smiles. "She needs time," he'd explained quietly as the children bounded up my front steps, eager to reunite with Rusty and rediscover their favorite hiding spots in the house they'd been absent from for so long. "This isn't easy for her." I nodded, watching Sophie kneel to embrace my aging terrier, who wiggled with delight at the unexpected attention. "And you?" I asked, studying Mark's face. "How are you handling all this?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Richard's it made my heart ache. "Honestly, I'm still processing everything. I had no idea she'd been keeping the kids from you. She told me you were the one who didn't want to visit." The betrayal in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever Catherine's secret was, this new deception had created its own fracture in their marriage. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "Despite everything, I didn't want to see their family broken." Mark nodded, then glanced at his watch. "I'll pick them up tomorrow afternoon around 4, if that works." "Of course. Anytime." And then he was gone, leaving me with my grandchildren and a hollow victory that felt nothing like I'd imagined during those lonely months of separation. The weekend itself was wonderful. We baked cookies, played board games, and watched old movies that had been Richard's favorites. Jack showed me how his engineering kit worked, constructing a small solar-powered car that we raced up and down the driveway. Sophie helped me in the garden, planting tulip bulbs for spring while she chattered about school and her piano lessons. But Catherine's absence loomed large, an invisible barrier between the complete joy we might have felt and the reality we lived in. When Jack asked why his mother hadn't come too, I had no good answer. "Is Mom still mad at you?" Sophie asked that night as I tucked her into the guest bedroom that I'd kept ready for her visits, unchanged since her last sleepover almost a year earlier. "Your mom and I have some grown-up things to work through," I said carefully, smoothing her hair away from her forehead. "But that has nothing to do with how much we both love you and Jack." Sophie's eyes, so like Richard's, studied my face with unsettling perception. "It was about the letter, wasn't it? The one you tore up in court." My hand stilled. "You know about that?" She nodded solemnly. "I heard Mom and Aunt Patricia talking about it. They didn't know I was listening. Aunt Patricia was really angry that you destroyed it." Of course she was. Patricia had spent years ensuring Catherine's secret remained buried, probably as much to protect the family's reputation as to shield Catherine herself. The letter had been a threat to that carefully maintained facade. "What was in it?" Sophie asked, her voice small in the darkness of the bedroom. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Something private between your mom and grandpa. Something that doesn't change how much we all love each other." She seemed to accept this, snuggling deeper under the quilt I'd made for her when she was born. "Grandma?" she whispered as I turned to leave. "Yes, sweetheart? I'm glad you're my grandma again." The words pierced my heart. I never stopped being your grandma, Sophie. Not for a single second. After the children were asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen, at the same table where I'd first read Richard's letter. The house felt different with Sophie and Jack under its roof. Warmer, more alive, filled with purpose again. But something was still missing. I found myself remembering Catherine's words at the recital, the ones that had started this whole painful journey. "You'll never be Grandpa of the Year." They echoed in my mind, cruel and dismissive. Richard had been an exceptional grandfather, it was true. Patient, attentive, always ready with a story or a lesson or simply his undivided attention. The children had adored him, and his death had left a void in all our lives. But Catherine's accusation went deeper than simple comparison. It was as if she'd been waiting for me to fail, measuring my every action against an impossible standard. And when I inevitably fell short, as everyone must, she'd seized the opportunity to push me away. Why? What had I done to deserve such treatment from my only child? The answer, I knew, lay in those torn scraps of paper, now presumably destroyed. Whatever Richard had confessed about Catherine's past had shaped her into the defensive, perfectionist woman she'd become. Had I known about it all along, would I have been a different mother? Could I have helped her heal instead of inadvertently deepening her wounds? Sunday passed too quickly, filled with pancake breakfasts and leaf pile jumping and stories by the fireplace. When Mark arrived to pick up the children, they clung to me with fierce hugs and promises to return soon. "Next weekend?" Jack asked hopefully, looking between Mark and me. Mark hesitated. "We'll see, buddy. Let's talk to Mom first." The house felt cavernous after they left. The silence oppressive where just hours before there had been laughter and chatter. Rusty sensed my mood, pressing his warm body against my leg as I stood at the window, watching Mark's car disappear down the street. I should have felt triumphant. I'd won, hadn't I? The court had sided with me. Catherine had withdrawn her petition. My grandchildren were back in my life. So why did I feel so empty? That night I found myself in our bedroom, mine and Richard's, staring at his side of the bed that I still couldn't bring myself to sleep on. The pillow still held the indent of his head, preserved like a museum piece beneath the freshly laundered pillowcase I changed weekly. "What would you say to me now?" I asked his portrait on the wall. "Did I do the right thing tearing up your letter? Or have I just postponed the inevitable confrontation?" The house creaked and settled around me, its familiar sounds offering no answers. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows in a rhythm that had once lulled us both to sleep on countless nights just like this one. I thought of Catherine as a little girl, her small hand in mine as we walked to the neighborhood park. How she'd looked up at me with complete trust, complete love. When had that changed? When had I become someone she needed to guard against, to shield her children from? The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof. I lay down on Richard's side of the bed, pressing my face into his pillow, searching for any lingering trace of him. But there was nothing, just clean cotton and the faint scent of lavender sachets. "You'll never be Grandpa of the Year." The words followed me into fitful dreams, where I ran through endless corridors trying to reach Sophie and Jack, always just around the next corner, their laughter tantalizingly close but never quite attainable. In the morning, I awoke still wearing yesterday's clothes, my eyes swollen from tears I didn't remember crying. The victory I'd won in court felt hollow now, a technical success that had done nothing to heal the real wounds between Catherine and me. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the early morning light filter through the rain-washed windows. The weekend with Sophie and Jack had been wonderful, but it had also shown me just how much damage had been done. One torn letter couldn't erase months of alienation, years of underlying tension. The real work of healing our family was just beginning. Winter settled over Columbus like a heavy blanket, transforming the landscape into a monochrome painting of whites and grays. 3 months had passed since the courtroom drama, and a delicate new routine had established itself. Every other weekend, Sophie and Jack would stay with me. Sometimes Mark would bring them. Other times, they'd arrive in Catherine's silver SUV, though she rarely came to the door, preferring to wait in the car with the engine running. The children flourished in this new arrangement. Sophie's piano playing improved dramatically. She'd been selected to perform a Mozart piece at the spring recital. Jack had joined a robotics club at school and spent hours in Richard's old workshop, tinkering with circuits and motors. They filled my house with noise and mess and life again, leaving traces of themselves in every room. Sophie's hair ribbons on the bathroom counter, Jack's comic book spread across the coffee table. But Catherine remained a ghost at the periphery of our happiness, present only in her absence. December arrived with the first real snowfall of the season. I spent a full day decorating the house for Christmas, hanging the ornaments Richard and I had collected over 42 years of marriage, setting up the nativity scene Catherine had made in 6th grade, baking gingerbread cookies from Richard's mother's recipe. The children would be coming for the entire week between Christmas and New Year's, the longest visit since our reconciliation, and I wanted everything to be perfect. On Christmas Eve, I attended the candlelight service at First Presbyterian alone, as I had for the past 3 years. Richard and I had always sat in the same pew, third from the front on the left side, close enough to see the pastor's face but not so close as to be conspicuous. After his death, I'd continued the tradition, leaving space beside me as if he might still join me, materializing out of the shadows cast by hundreds of flickering candles. This year, however, something unexpected happened. As the congregation sang Silent Night, the familiar melody weaving through the darkened sanctuary, I sensed movement beside me. Looking up, I saw Catherine sliding into the pew, her face illuminated by the small candle she held. She didn't look at me, didn't speak, just stood there singing the familiar carol, her voice a soft counterpoint to mine. When the service ended, I expected her to leave immediately, avoiding any conversation. Instead, she remained seated as the congregation filed out, staring straight ahead at the empty pulpit. "Mom," she said finally, when we were almost alone in the vast space, "I need to talk to you." My heart raced with anxiety and hope. "Of course. Not here," she said, glancing around at the few lingering parishioners. Can I come over tomorrow, after the kids open their presents?" "I'd like that," I said carefully, afraid to show too much emotion, too much eagerness. "Around noon?" She nodded, finally meeting my eyes. Hers were so like Richard's, the same deep brown with flecks of gold near the pupil. "Merry Christmas, Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Merry Christmas, Catherine." She left then, disappearing into the snowy night, leaving me sitting alone in our family pew, my candle still burning, illuminating the space where Richard should have been. Christmas morning brought squeals of delight from Sophie and Jack as they unwrapped their gifts. Mark sat nearby, snapping photos and helping with particularly stubborn packaging. The living room floor disappeared beneath a sea of colorful wrapping paper and ribbons while Rusty investigated each new toy with enthusiastic sniffs. At precisely noon, the doorbell rang. The children were upstairs trying on new clothes, and Mark was in the kitchen making hot chocolate. I smoothed my festive red sweater, took a deep breath and opened the door. Catherine stood on the porch, snow dusting her dark hair, a small gift-wrapped package in her gloved hands. She looked nervous, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "It's freezing out there." She entered hesitantly, as if crossing the threshold of a stranger's home, rather than the house she'd grown up in. I took her coat and hung it in the closet, noting how thin she seemed, how the bones of her wrists protruded sharply as she removed her gloves. "The kids are upstairs," I explained. "Do you want to see them first, or—" "Actually," she interrupted, "I was hoping we could talk privately first. Is that okay?" I nodded, leading her into Richard's study, a room largely unchanged since his death. His leather chair still faced the window overlooking the backyard. His reading glasses still rested on the side table beside a book he'd never finish. It was the most private room in the house, the one place where I still felt his presence most strongly. Catherine sat on the small sofa near the fireplace, perching on the edge as if ready to flee at any moment. I took Richard's chair, swiveling it to face her. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said abruptly, the words tumbling out as if she'd rehearsed them many times. "Since the court hearing, Mark insisted after everything." "I think that's wonderful," I said sincerely. She twisted her wedding ring nervously. We've been talking about Dad, about what happened in college, about the letter. My breath caught. Catherine, you don't have to. I do, she interrupted. I need to say this. She looked up, meeting my eyes with determination. I always thought you knew. All these years I assumed Dad had told you back then and you both decided to pretend it never happened. I shook my head slowly. No, he never told me anything. Not until the end. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. That's what Patricia said, but I didn't believe her. It seemed impossible that you wouldn't know, that Dad would keep something like that from you for so long. Your father believed he was protecting you, I said gently. And me, in his own way. Catherine stared at the small package in her lap, running her fingers over the silver ribbon. My therapist thinks I've been punishing you, that I was afraid you would judge me if you knew the truth. So I tried to push you away before you could reject me. The pieces were finally falling into place. Her perfectionism, her defensiveness, her disproportionate reaction to my missing Sophie's recital. It had never really been about that night at all. Catherine, I said, leaning forward to take her cold hands in mine, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, you could ever do that would make me stop loving you. You're my daughter, my only child. That doesn't change, no matter what. Tears spilled down her cheeks, dropping onto the gift box. Even after what I did, keeping the kids from you, lying to Mark, to everyone, even then, I assured her, we all make mistakes, sweetheart. We all do things we regret. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so reminiscent of her childhood self that my heart ached with recognition. I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything. I know, I said simply. I am too. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of Richard's old desk clock and the distant laughter of the children upstairs. Finally, Catherine held out the small package. This is for you. I found it among Dad's things. I unwrapped it carefully, peeling back layers of tissue paper to reveal a small worn leather box. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a thin chain. I recognized it immediately. It had been Richard's first gift to me, given on our first anniversary. Open it, Catherine urged softly. Inside, where once there had been tiny photos of Richard and me as newlyweds, now there were new pictures. Sophie and Jack, their faces beaming in recent school portraits. Dad had it all planned out, Catherine explained, her voice steadier now. He asked me to have the photos updated after he was gone, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Until now. I clasped the locket around my neck, feeling its familiar weight against my collarbone. It's perfect, I whispered, unable to say more past the lump in my throat. Mom! Mom! Sophie's excited voice called from upstairs. Come see what Grandma got us. Catherine smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I should go up and see them. As she rose to leave the study, I caught her hand one last time. Catherine, those words you said at the recital, about me never being Grandpa of the Year, they hurt more than you know. She flinched, her face clouding with shame. I'm sorry, I was cruel. I don't need your apology, I said, squeezing her hand. I just need you to understand something. I never wanted to be Richard. I only ever wanted to be your mother, their grandmother. That's enough for me. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Recognition of the impossible standard she'd been holding me to, the one I could never meet. It's more than enough, she whispered. It's everything. As we walked upstairs together to join the children, I felt Richard's presence more strongly than I had since his death, not as a ghost or a memory, but as the foundation upon which our family had been built, the love that connected us all, even when words and actions had failed. The secret that had threatened to destroy us had, in the end, forced us to confront the deeper truths we'd been avoiding. Some silences don't protect. They only prolong the pain. Some truths, however difficult, must be spoken to allow healing to begin. That Christmas day, surrounded by my family, I understood at last what Richard had meant in his final days. The truth will cost dearly, but it must be told. The price had indeed been high, but what we'd gained in return was beyond measure. They say the most painful wounds are the ones inflicted by those we love the most. When my daughter said those cruel words at Sophie's recital, "You'll never be Grandpa of the Year," she had no idea how deeply they would cut, or how that moment would set us on a path that nearly destroyed our family. But sometimes the greatest acts of love require the most painful sacrifices. I could have used Richard's letter to defend myself, to expose Catherine's secret and win. Instead, I chose to tear it up, to protect her even when she was trying to hurt me. What would you have done in my position? Would you have revealed the truth to save your relationship with your grandchildren? Or would you have protected your child's secret, even at the cost of your own happiness? Sometimes there are no perfect answers in family conflicts, only impossible choices, and the hope that love will eventually heal what pride and fear have broken. If this story touched your heart, please consider following my channel for more stories about family, forgiveness, and the complicated love that binds us together, even when we try to pull apart. Like this video if you believe that sometimes the strongest people aren't those who win every battle, but those who know which battles not to fight. Share with someone who might need to hear that forgiveness isn't just a gift we give others, it's freedom we give ourselves. Remember, every family has secrets, but it's how we handle them that defines who we truly are.